welcome to FO Talks. With me is Gary Grappo, our former chairman again. As you know, he is a distinguished diplomat, or he was a distinguished diplomat for the US State Department. He is a professor. He's a great thinker. And today we'll be discussing what's going on in the Red Sea. So, Gary, what's going on with the Houthis in Yemen and what are they doing to the Red Sea?
Well, it's great to be with you again, Atul. And in discussing this, it's important to keep an eye, of course, on the greater crisis now underway in the Middle East, which, of course, is the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas taking place in Gaza. And the brewing crisis in the Red Sea is not surprisingly connected to that conflict. Namely, the Houthis, which is an Iran-aligned organization based in northern Yemen, controls all of northern Yemen, and is probably home to, I want to say, 60 to 70% of the population, is an avowed enemy of Israel as well as the United States. The official name of the organization is Ansar Allah, the supporters of God. And in extremist groups of this nature, yes. And in fact, if you look at their motto, God is great. And of course, then there's the standard death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory to Islam. And so consistent with that motto, they are now exercising their role in the war as a part of the axis of Iran's axis of resistance in Gaza by initially saying that they were going to go after Israel, then Israeli vessels transiting the Red Sea, and now have largely expanded it to just about anyone they don't like, or vessels that are in transit to a country they don't like. They probably have carried out well over a dozen attacks or attempted attacks on vessels. They've captured 2 and have ushered them in to the port of Hodeidah, which is the major Yemeni port on the Red Sea. And so, not surprisingly, this has created a real problem for global commerce. I mean, let's take a look at the Red Sea.
Yes, very quickly before you crack on about the problem, explain to our viewers and listeners the importance of the Red Sea.
Exactly. The Red Sea is one of the great transit thoroughfares for sea navigation in the world. If you look at the Red Sea, at the southern end, there is a narrow passage known as the Bab-el-Mandeb. It is a choke point. It's relatively narrow, and all vessels transiting into the Red Sea, either in or out, must pass through the Bab-el-Mandeb. And that borders Yemen on the sort of the northern side of the Red Sea. On the south side, you have Somalia. And then it transits the Red Sea, and at the northern terminus of the Red Sea, where it branches off into the Gulf of Aqaba, that heads a little bit more toward the north, and to ports in Jordan and Israel, Eilat and Aqaba in Israel and Jordan, respectively. And the other branch, the main branch, goes to the Suez Canal, which is wholly within Egyptian territory and is managed by the Egyptian authorities. And of course, traffic passes through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and onward to Europe and points west. So, not surprisingly, it is a major, major thoroughfare. From the Egyptian perspective, this past year they collected almost $10 billion in toll revenues. Well, that amounts to about 5% of hard currency earnings for the government of Egypt, which is facing genuine economic hardship at the moment. So a very important matter for the Egyptians. But the Red Sea as a whole supports about 12% of global maritime trade, moving both toward the Mediterranean and out toward the Indian Ocean. 30% of global container traffic passes through the Red Sea. Every day, about 7 million barrels of oil and 4.5 billion cubic feet of gas pass through the Red Sea. So this is a critically important sea passage for a global maritime traffic and for global trade. And that's the problem that has been created, is that this is a significant, if not major, disruption to the global economy. If vessels cannot transit the Red Sea, their only recourse is to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, southern Africa, and then north to ports in Europe, or for vessels coming from Europe, down the western coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then to ports in South Asia, or further ports in the Far East, namely China, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. Not surprisingly.
So conservative estimates, or rather, let's say estimates, have found that many ships that go from Asia to Europe and take 13 days would take 31 or more, depending on where they are going. And so that means more oil, more labor costs of the crew, more oil usage of the ships, more delays.
Insurance rates go up.
Exactly.
Fuel rates go up. With an impediment of this nature, the price of everything is going to go up, whether it's oil, whether it's natural gas, or whether it's products. And, a container ship can easily carry $250 million in merchandise, depending on what it's carrying. Is it carrying chips? Is it carrying computer equipment? Is it carrying commodities, grain, oils, edible oils of various natures? So it's impossible to underestimate the importance of this passageway, and its disruption will cause significant hiccups in the global economy, and we'll see that in the price of goods.
So inflationary pressures will go up, which means that there will be upward pressure on interest rates, which means that this could have a major spillover effect on the global economy, not just global trade.
Yes, obviously when prices go up, which is a consequence of this, purchases will go down, and that will affect the economies of a number of countries. One of the countries least affected, actually, by this will be the United States, since most of our traffic goes through the Panama Canal, which, by the way, is facing its own challenges today, thanks to a drought in the southern portion of Central America, which has brought the water level in the canal down to dangerous levels, and so they've had to restrict the number of vessels that can go through the Panama Canal. So we're affected by this in other ways, but countries around the world are going to be affected. Most critically, I think, will be Europe, South Asia, and the Far East.
So you've given us a brief outline of the Houthis. Tell us more about the Houthis. What exactly are they, apart from their name and motto? Who backs them? Surely they can't be manufacturing the weapons they're using to target ships by themselves. What is their long game, apart from destruction to Israel and America and death to all Jews? What is their long game? What gives them the support of the population base in the areas they command in Yemen?
The Houthis, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the tribal name, at least the name of the dominant tribe, they have been engaged in a civil war with other factions in Yemen, principally in the southern and southeastern portions of the country. This war has been going on since 2014. It's tragically taken the lives of close to 400,000 people, and that's a very rough estimate because the United Nations has stopped tracking this figure because it's so difficult for them to collect accurate data. A good percentage, I would say probably over half of those deaths have been caused by diseases because of the inability to get in proper medicine, proper medical care, and the medical professionals necessary to treat people. So you see, for example, deaths, particularly among children, from diseases like cholera, dengue, COVID, and others. And so they have been fighting this war against these other factions. These factions have been variously backed by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries. The Houthis belong to the Zaydi sect of Islam, which is a Shia-related sect of Islam. So they're not identical to the sect that dominates in Iran. They are known as Twelvers. That is the reference to the imam they regard as the highest authority, that is human authority. And the Zaydis look to a different imam. I think they're either 5 or 7 generals. I can't remember. But in any respect, they're similar but not identical to the sect of Shia in Iran. And they have been fighting in this civil war against predominantly Sunni Yemeni factions throughout the country. They initially were not that close to Iran, but I would say over the last 10 to 12 years, they have developed ties, growing ties, very strong ties to Iran, which saw the opportunity of the civil war to create problems for Saudi Arabia, which supported some of the various Sunni factions, including the former government, which was ousted by the Houthis in 2016 and 2017 and took up residence in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Since then, however, the Saudis have been trying to extricate themselves from that civil war, and there have been ongoing negotiations, variously moderated, mediated by the United Nations, the Omanis, and the Kuwaitis. And so those negotiations are not completed yet. There is an unofficial truce in place, and there is a fair degree of optimism that perhaps they can end this war, or at least Saudi Arabia's role in it, which would separate the Houthis and the Saudis from further conflict. So the Saudis are a bit hesitant to involve themselves in this latest crisis in the Red Sea for fear of disrupting these ongoing negotiations. But nevertheless,
the previous experience, Saudi experience of fighting the Houthis has been pretty disastrous. Their military was weighed, measured, and found wanting. There were videos of fat Saudi brigadiers falling flat on their faces. It was quite amusing, actually.
The Saudis actually dispatched very few of their ground forces into Yemen. They found other ways. Their air force was quite active and came under heavy criticism from the West, including the United States, for their indiscriminate bombing of villages and towns in the Houthi-controlled areas, to the point that we had, not surprisingly, very high numbers of civilian or non-combatant casualties. And it led the U.S. Congress as far back as the Trump administration, and certainly in the Biden administration, to argue in favor of cutting off U.S. military trade with Saudi Arabia, which we have done to a limited extent. We are supporting the Saudis in their negotiations. Interestingly, the Saudis used mercenaries. In fact, before the coup, that overthrew the previous president of Sudan. They were using Sudanese military forces who had been conscripted, given a little bit of military training, and then a weapon, and then sent to fight for the Saudis in Yemen. And at one time, the Sudanese troop levels were as many as 12,000, basically taking their orders by cell phone and radio from their Saudi handlers in Saudi Arabia.
So it didn't quite succeed. And who's backing the Houthis? It's an open secret, but still.
Well, of course, it's the Iranians. As I mentioned earlier, the Iranians saw a real opportunity here to, for very little expense, by the way, to cause a nagging security problem for Saudi Arabia. At one point,
very quick logistical question for you. If you look at the Houthis, they live on the western tip, the southwestern tip of, they control the area in the southwestern tip of Yemen. Iran is, of course, to the northeast.
It's closer to the northern, northwestern tip, but extends down into Sana'a. It does not include the main oil producing area of Yemen, known as Mandeb,
Yes.
which is closer to the Saudi border. They fought very heavily for months to gain control of this and were unsuccessful. Nevertheless, they control a sizable number of the population. They control the port of Hodeidah, which is the largest port on the.
It's on the Red Sea. Yeah. So, but how does Iran get weapons through? And how does it do it at such low cost? Because there's Oman in the way, there is Mahra that is controlled by Isla, PLC and allies. You have STC and allies controlling Shabwa. So much of Yemen, much of what lies east of Houthi-controlled Yemen is not exactly friends of the Houthis. So how does Iran manage to get around? I know I asked this question regarding Hamas too. How does Iran manage to have its supply chain, its supply routes?
Well, of course, Iran has become very adept at avoiding sanctions and at avoiding various types of interdiction that are underway in order to get the necessary military equipment, including drones and rockets, from Iran into the areas of their axis of resistance allies, to include the Houthis. There are occasions when Western naval vessels like the United States and other countries have stopped the vessels and seized the cargo, which would often include weapons. Most often would, otherwise they wouldn't stop it. And but nevertheless, many get through. Many get through. And they took a page from their strategy that was used first in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, and then later in Gaza, and they began training the Houthis in how to fabricate some of the more basic types of weapons themselves, using various items that were locally available or could be easily acquired. And that's what they're doing now. So the weapons that the Houthis are using to attack the vessels are easily acquired. Simple drones that have been modified they're either suicide drones or drones that can drop smaller ordnance. So not necessarily enough that would sink a major commercial vessel, but certainly can cause damage and even death of the crew. And now they've begun launching ballistic missiles. My suspicion is the ballistic missiles, without question, would have had to come from Iran. I don't believe the Houthis are at the stage yet where they can fabricate a ballistic missile. And they probably got some pretty sophisticated training and the handling, and the launching, and the control of a ballistic missile, because a ballistic missile was launched at least one vessel, and it's rare, and maybe it's never happened, that a ballistic missile, which basically means it reaches apogee, which is its highest point, almost out of the atmosphere, and then after that, it just follows the inherent energy in the missile down to its target. And there's no propulsion once it reaches apogee, the highest point in its trajectory. And therefore, they doubtlessly received considerable training from the Iranians and equally the missiles themselves. What we have to watch for in the future, as we have in Gaza, is the growing capability of the Houthis to develop, manufacture these types of weapons themselves, and particularly when it comes to drone technology, which is so easily available on the commercial side, and then it's quickly adapted for military use.
So why are the Houthis doing what they are doing?
The Gaza War. To put it simply, they are part
Surely
of the
they must have some of their own interests at stake. They can't just do it out of Islamic solidarity.
Well, if you look at all the various fronts associated with the war in Gaza, obviously the principal front is within Gaza itself, but there's another significant front in the border region between southern Lebanon and northern Israel. There is the West Bank. There is eastern Syria and northwestern Iraq, where various Iranian-aligned militia groups are launching attacks against the United States. And the Houthis are part of that. And the principle here is to go after Israel to the extent that they can directly, but also Israel's supporters, principal among which, of course, is the United States. And then secondly, the Western countries with close ties to the United States and their economies. What is interesting to note about this particular situation in the Red Sea and the conflict underway there is that this is Iran's answer to the wide range of sanctions, economic sanctions, imposed not only by the United States, but by European countries and other countries against Iran for its support of terrorism, for its threats against Israel, for its human rights record, and of course for its nuclear weapons program. And so Iran, in a way, is demonstrating that it has a counterpart to sanctions, and that is its efforts to disrupt the global commerce. And in particular, the ability of global commerce to move through one of its principal thoroughfares, the Red Sea. And it's using the instrument, the proxy, of the Houthis to do that.
So plausible deniability combined with maximal leverage.
Yes, but it's pretty thinly veiled. I mean, just about everyone understands that the Houthis are acting to some degree at the behest of the Iranians. Do the Iranians actually plan these attacks? Probably not. Are the Iranians urging them to carry out these attacks against these commercial vessels and other vessels, including naval vessels? I don't think there's any question about that. And as was just reported today, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal, it's very, very likely that the Iranians are supplying intelligence information to the Houthis as well, namely the vessels transiting the Red Sea and what they perhaps might be carrying, who the crew might be, who owns the vessel, and its ultimate destination. And based on all of that, they decide whether it's worthy of an attack by the Houthis.
Yeah, I mean, we are hearing that shipping companies such as Hapag, Lloyd, and Maersk have stopped moving things through the Red Sea. And we hear BP is not going to be taking oil through it. We hear that insurance companies don't want to insure ships right now passing through the Red Sea. So it is a real headache. It's a real blockage. What happens next, Gary?
Yes, and many have asked that very question, and led by the United States, a small coalition of countries, about 10 countries, plus the United States, have come together to form a security force within the Red Sea.
Which are these 10 countries, please?
Some of them are very predictable. Certainly the United States and the U.S.'s principal allies in Europe, to include the U.K., France, Italy, Spain, Canada, the Netherlands. The only Arab country that has publicly acknowledged membership in this group is Bahrain, but there are probably at least a dozen other countries that are actively involved, but for political reasons don't want to be identified with this coalition because of its connection to the war in Gaza. I mean, if you look at two countries most directly impacted by the instability now in the Red Sea, by these Houthi attacks, it's Egypt, which I mentioned at the outset, is heavily dependent on canal revenues, and Saudi Arabia. Once you get past the Yemeni coast, the entire coastline going north until you reach the Gulf of Aqaba is Saudi.
Yeah, but the Saudis are not suffering that much economically because their oil is in the eastern province, which is their Shia minority region, whom they oppress with an iron hand. That's another story. But they get their revenue more through the Persian Gulf. So in terms of economic consequences, Saudi Arabia is not paying a price for it.
That's true. Saudi Arabia is paying a relatively low price. They do ship some oil out of their West Coast port in Jeddah, but actually it's I'm trying to remember the name of the port, the major oil port just north of Jeddah. But for the most part, it's all going via the Persian Gulf. But nevertheless, this is clearly the sort of instability that Saudi Arabia does not like to have taking place just off its coastline. And then there is the other matter that we discussed earlier, which is the ongoing efforts to bring an end to the civil war in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia has a major interest in that.
That's true. So the port, is it Rabigh, next to King Abdullah Economic City?
No.
Is it Ar-Rais or is it Yanbu?
Yanbu.
Yanbu. Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Yanbu.
Okay, it's Yanbu. Interesting. So Saudi Arabia's interest is largely to curtail political instability, and that's why they are interested. Talk us through what this means for Europe and Asia, because Europe and Asia are interconnected through the Suez. In fact, part of the reason the Suez Canal was built was to ship troops easily to India to crush any potential rebellion after 1857. So, Europeans are not going to come to Asia to crush any rebellions anymore, but they're certainly sending good stuff over, and the Asians are sending good stuff over, goods over. And this certainly is a bit of a pinprick, more than a pinprick for that trade.
Needless to say, there's an extensive amount of trade between Europe and the Far East, and most especially with China. And I venture to say almost all of that, when it comes to merchandise, moves via the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And so it has...
And going around the Cape of Good Hope, as we just discussed, it's roughly 13 to 31. We just invert the digits, and that's the difference, and that's huge.
Exactly. So the repercussions for both Europe and China are significant. What is noteworthy is that China, which may have the most to lose here, given as how many of their products are moving east into to west to Europe, is not part of this coalition. And I believe some discussions preliminary discussions have taken place. Also noteworthy is the Chinese have a base. I believe it's their only base outside of China in the country of Djibouti, which is located just outside the Bab-el-Mandeb. A number of other countries, including the United States, Japan, and France. And I think the UAE also have bases in Djibouti. And there may be other countries, but there's a possibility that China could do something, cooperate in some fashion. I don't think they have been formally invited to join this coalition, but the question remains, given what they have to lose potentially with this disruption in the Red Sea, would they take a more active role in ensuring the security and safety of vessels moving through the Red Sea? And then you have to look at the oil traffic moving out of the Persian Gulf, whether from Saudi Arabia or from Kuwait or from Iraq, out into the Indian Ocean and up into the Red Sea on its way to Europe. So, and of course, oil prices have already suffered as a result of the Russia's war against Ukraine. And so this is additional pressure on global oil markets.
Upward pressure on oil markets, which leads to upward pressure on interest rates, as we've discussed.
Yes. Yeah, so there's no upside to this new aspect of the conflict in Gaza today. I will have to admit that at the start of the war in Gaza, I looked at the Houthis principally as a minor annoyance to Israel. I don't know whether U.S. authorities had a different perspective. I don't know how aware they might have been of the potential for the Houthis to be this disruptive in the Red Sea. They don't present, at this point in time, a direct threat to Israel, but it doesn't take much forethought or much foresight to see what could potentially develop in the case of the Houthis presenting a much more serious threat to Saudi Arabia, given their proximity and now the availability of ballistic weapons. The current ones they have seem to be relatively short-range. It's not clear that they necessarily could reach Israel. They've tried to launch some rockets toward Israel. Most of them fell short or were shot down by either U.S. vessels in the Red Sea or by the Israelis. So, but it's something that bears watching, certainly for the Israelis, who have always looked at the Houthis as a real threat to their security.
You've said something very interesting just now. I was making notes, and you said that they have ballistic missiles, and that could be a threat, especially as the range increases. What is the range as of now, and what could the range go up to?
Well, if they're getting them from Iran, which unquestionably they are, the Iranians have ballistic missiles that are capable of traveling as much as 2,000 kilometers. Easily within the range, from Iran of Israel, and even some southeastern NATO countries. Certainly Greece, potentially Turkey, and maybe the very southern areas of Italy, if they have longer range ballistic missiles. I'm not an expert on their missile armaments, but they're developing fairly sophisticated ballistic missiles. I don't think they would make available to the Houthis, at least at this point in time, some of these longer range ones. But it wouldn't take much, 600 to 700 kilometers, in order to be within striking range of Israel.
So this brings me on to another thought, and I'm thinking that if the Houthis keep exercising leverage, economic leverage, there might be pressure from the rest of the world, maybe not the US as much, on Israel to end the war against Hamas.
Well, we're already seeing that. I mean, just from the nature of the conflict itself and the and the terrible humanitarian toll it's taken in Gaza itself, there's enormous pressure around the world on the Israelis to curtail, if not cease, their hostilities in Gaza. The UN just today, the UN Security Council passed a very much watered down resolution calling for a pause, not a ceasefire. The United States previously vetoed a Security Council resolution that called for a ceasefire, but they're calling for a pause in order to address the humanitarian problems now that are rampant within Gaza. And so this adds a new dimension to the conflict in the sense that it has global economic repercussions. I don't think they've manifested themselves as of yet.
No, not yet. Because shipping contracts have lag times. They're negotiated way in advance, and the way it works is that the current goods will be delivered as to earlier prices. However, if the conflict persists, then the new prices that companies get from these shipping companies will be higher, so there'll be a lag time. So it's a lagging economic indicator, but the effects will be significant as and when they come, unless the realities change.
Unquestionably. Now, so we've seen already the exercise of two options that are available. First option is send these vessels via a different route around the Cape of Good Hope. Now we see this coalition formed by the Americans to provide additional security in the Red Sea to protect these vessels. Now there are a couple of other options. First of all, there's the potential expansion of this coalition beyond the current 11 countries to include the U.S. Countries, for example, like Germany, Japan, and China, which have direct and significant interest at stake here, given the economic repercussions. And then there's, of course, the fourth option, and that is direct military engagement and action against the Houthis. That is to neutralize some of these launch sites, whether it's ballistic missiles, which, comparatively speaking, might be easier to target than drones. I mean, drones can pretty much take off from anywhere, and it's virtually impossible to destroy every drone. But there are other targets, not necessarily directly related to these attacks, but the command and control facilities in the Houthi areas are certainly potential targets. So I think it really bears watching. My suspicion is there are very quiet conversations now taking place about the military option. A lot of countries, most especially Saudi Arabia in the region, don't want to see this for fear of, like everything else connected with the war in Gaza, it could escalate. There's a question of, well, if they're going to go after the Houthis, might they also go after the Iranian vessels supporting the Houthis? For example, if they have any vessels in the Red Sea, which they do, that might be collecting and sharing intelligence information with the Houthis, could they be potential targets? And I think, without question, the response is yes, definitely. But will we go after those? That's the real question.
And that, if that were to happen, could bring Iran into the war, could make it a regional conflagration.
Yes. Yeah. And and that's what it seems all sides, for the moment, want to avoid.
So you've been a diplomat, you've been a superstar diplomat. So given what you have done and what you've seen in the past, is it likely that American diplomats are talking very quietly to Iranian diplomats and saying, Guys, get your hotheads to take a deep breath.
Well, of course, the United States does not speak directly with the Iranians.
Well, yes, but they do speak. I mean,
But there are many others with whom we can speak to deliver that kind of a message.
I mean, the Qataris, for a start, they could deliver that message.
There are a whole host of countries. The Saudis now have reestablished diplomatic ties, which they're very protective of, by the way, with Iran.
Yeah, thanks to China.
Yes. The Chinese did the easy part. They basically put the bow on the package. The hard lifting was done by the Omanis and the Iraqis, actually. Uh-huh. And basically the final measure was the Chinese to sort of put the imprimatur of a global power on this rapprochement between them. So I'm sure the Saudis are delivering a very similar message that this is not serving our bilateral interests. You mentioned the Qataris as well. But then don't forget the Chinese. The Chinese have considerable influence with the Iranians, probably more than any other country.
They're their biggest they're their biggest importer, or rather, they're their biggest Iran's biggest export market is China, and the maximum number of goods to Iran that come from outside come from China. So they have a very strong and deep trading relationship. I suspect there's also a fair bit of Chinese capital going into Iran.
Yes, and that's not necessarily germane to our conversation, but yes, without question, there is capital going in there. There's a considerable amount of trade, and not only oil, other products as well, merchandise. So China has a vested interest in not seeing this conflict escalate and reach the point where the Iranians themselves are now engaged in warfare at one level or another with Israel, and certainly with Israel's allies, most importantly, the United States. And by the way, I don't think the Iranians, in fact, I'm fairly certain the Iranians do not want to get into a shooting match with the Americans either. No one wants to see this conflict in Gaza escalate beyond where it is now. Several parties are pushing the envelope, particularly those backed by Iran, whether it's Hezbollah up on the Israeli border in the north, or these militia groups that I mentioned earlier in eastern Syria and northwestern Iraq. So there are a number of countries who could deliver the mail to the Iranians that this is not a good idea. The question is, will the Iranians listen, and will they in turn apply pressure on the Houthis to rein in some of these attacks that have taken place in the Red Sea?
And if they did, would these attacks stop?
It all depends on how strongly the message is delivered by Tehran. If the Iranians say, maybe you shouldn't be going after some of these Western vessels. Okay, you want to go after the Israelis? We don't mind that. But you need to back off of some of these Western countries because our strongest trade partner is paying a price, namely China. I mean, this is a very logical message to be delivered. And overall, it threatens real escalation in this conflict.
So, in your estimates, can we expect to see an end to hostilities by 2024? Will there be some kind of backroom deal? Or do you see this spiraling out of control? Or do you see something in between? You see this low-grade annoyance continuing in the Houthis, testing the waters and going as far as they can.
With respect to the challenges of the Red Sea, quite honestly, I don't see the Houthis backing off, at least not enough to satisfy the U.S. and other Western countries and countries in the region. That is, the Houthis are determined to show that they are a viable force and gain recognition that they are a viable force and capable of causing considerable damage when things don't go their way or when various policies of countries don't accord with their own interests. So I don't see a solution on the horizon to this, and that's excluding conflict. Once, if and when attacks are launched against the Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen, then we'll be facing a whole different set of circumstances, and it raises the whole question of Iran's position in such an eventuality.
All right, Gary, thank you so much for your time. Very enlightening, if not uplifting today. It seems geopolitical risks are on the rise. It seems people, governments, companies have to adapt to it. And it seems that we'll have a fraught new year. In any case, Merry Christmas to you, Gary, and happy holidays and happy new year.
Thank you so much, Atul, and I hope we all have a happy and certainly more peaceful new year.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.